Surely Democrats in Congress would not pass a law forcing these workers to take a bad contract. I mean, surely not.
Yeah, about that.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We've got Mel Buer on the line. Have we got Mel on the line?
We sure do.
Hi.
Mel, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime.
So you've been on before, but remind folks a little bit about you and your work. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, my name is Mel Buer. I'm a freelance reporter currently working mostly with the Real News Network. A lot of my recent work has been labor reporting across the Midwest. I'm a university instructor at the University of Nebraska and podcaster, writer, all sorts of stuff.
Awesome. So what motivated you to do this piece? Why the railroads and why now?
Max Alvarez has done a couple of episodes with railroad workers over the last couple of months, starting from the institution of the Hi-Vis attendance policy with Bnsf earlier this year. He talked to Jeff Kurtz, who is a former railroad employee and former state legislator from Iowa, as well as other railroad employees about this attendance policy. When Max approached me in May to cover this rally, the solidarity rally in the beginning of May, a lot of it has to do with I'm located in the Midwest and I understand Midwestern labor politics more generally, and it was much easier for me to travel to this rally and speak to workers than it would have been for Max. And the story they told me is something else. These workers are being destroyed by what is essentially just these draconian sort of attendance policies and various cost-cutting measures that the rail carriers who are owned by billionaires like Warren Buffett and like overpaid CEOs are trying to implement to the detriment of the workers.
Right. And this is not only is it to the detriment of the workers, but because rail is so intertwined with our supply chain and it's to the detriment of everybody else, and which is kind of the hook of your article. Corporate billionaires are wrecking the supply chain. Just look at the railroads. But before we get to the effect that these policies and the effect on the workers are having on the supply chain, give us some more details about the policies themselves. What is it that the railroad workers are taking issue with, and what is its what are these policies? Why are they being implemented? The main topic of this article was about BNSF's Hi-Vis attendance policy, which is essentially this hyped up point system. Now, point systems are, we hear about these a lot. Kellogg's workers have a point system at their factory. A lot of industrial plants and even folks like Amazon will use point systems sort of like demerits. So essentially what it is it forces individuals to maintain a good attendance record. For the Hi-Vis policy, individuals who work for the railroad get 30 points over the course of their career. So you start at 30 points. And if you miss a day or you miss a phone call or you have an emergency or union business comes up or any sort of thing that you may take unscheduled time off, they dock points. And if your balance goes from 30 to 0, then you are subject to discipline. Your point total is reset to 15, not the full 30, 15. And then you have to maintain that attendance as well as possible. The policy itself allows for individuals to get certain amounts of points back, but it requires you to pretty much be on for 14 days straight. And if you take even scheduled time off, as far as I understand it, that sort of accrual of days resets. If you have a balance that drops to 0 3 times, you're fired. And this is, again, over the course of a career, right? And so what this is doing, essentially, is forcing workers to be on all the time. The way that the scheduling works with the railroad is that oftentimes you don't know when you're going to be scheduled. You may have to call in the morning every day, and you may be at a terminal on a train within, a couple of hours. So you can't even really like schedule doctor's appointments, for example, or, go see your kids play their softball and baseball games, or really be involved with your family. Because they are requiring these workers to pretty much just be ready to clock in. And if you aren't ready to clock in, then you could potentially lose your job.
Wow. That's the idea of having any sort of point system over the course of your career is mind-boggling to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, every plant...
Every plant, what?
Every business that institutes the points. There we go. My internet today is not super great, so if I cut out, that's why.
Gotcha. Yeah, we lost you at every plant.
Every plant has a different way of doing it. Kellogg's did it differently. But really all it is just punitive policies that is meant to really make it difficult for you to strike any sort of meaningful work-life balance. We all have lives outside of work, all of us, right? And we should be able to be afforded the ability to build those lives outside of work. And time again, these workplaces, whether it's the railroads or whether it's, a bar down the street, all of these individuals are required by their employers to create this life that privileges your work over what you're doing outside of work, and with BNSF and with, similar policies across the rail industry, there is no chance for you to be able to have that life, even if you're making good money and you have, you've built a family,
That's what really spoke to me, I think, was like the assault on our time. And this being a very flagrant example of it, but as you mentioned, it's not limited to just the rail industry, but there's an assault on our time that even when you're not being paid, even when you're not on the clock, you're still kind of on the clock. Mm-hmm. You're on call. You're expected to get the phone call. Depending on the type of work you do, it may be that you're expected to check that email 24/7. And it seems like in our economy, as time has gone on, there's just been a steady encroachment upon our time and that blurring of what's work time, what's personal time. And it just makes me think as a former history teacher, the fight for the 8-hour day was such a huge piece of the labor movement as we understand it. And it feels like we have moved backwards from that. From that victory of saying, hey, we have a solid 8 hours for work, anything over that's for overtime, et cetera, et cetera. And, this is, I think, one of the most flagrant examples out there of essentially being on call always. And that is just, it's shocking to expect people to live this way. And I presume that is part of why they're having trouble getting people to do these jobs.
Well, certainly with the railroads, there's plenty of open work with the railroads, but it's very difficult for a current rail employee to talk to their friends or their family members or people who may be interested in hiring on the railroad. And, I've talked to some workers who are like, I can't look these people in the eye and tell them that this is a good job.
Right.
They need to know what they're signing up for. And frankly, many workers are like, I wouldn't recommend this, because what you're doing is you're sacrificing your personal life for your life on the railroad. And that's not how it should be, because historically it's been a great job to have. It has stability. It affords you a rewarding career to be a part of this. And the rail carriers themselves, who are governed by, CEOs making millions of dollars a year, billionaires who are raking in billions in profit, had turned it into crap, and you can't really, how can you argue with that? You really can't, it's like, Sure, you can hire on, but don't plan on starting a family. Or if you have a family, don't plan on being there for the birth of your children, things like that. So.
Right. And I remember hearing hearing one of the rail workers themselves say that in an interview, I think with Max, either for the Real News or for Working People. And it's just, it's really sad. And it's something that like you and Adam have said, we've seen this across a lot of the other labor disputes over the past couple of years, like at Kellogg's and the UMWA. And what I've said on this program is it's almost like these people are being forced to sponsor their families, not actually be a part of it, but go to work, earn a living, and write the check to their families and not be able to participate in any of the life that the paycheck provides. Mm-hmm. And that's really just no way to live. It's no way to, it's dehumanizing, it's alienating, and it's all a choice that's being made by, like you said, these corporate billionaires. Is the attendance policy the biggest thing that these rail workers are up against, or are there other parts of the job that have deteriorated over time as well?
Yeah, I mean, what they're seeing over the last 5 or 6 years is that there's been a lot of workers who have been laid off, and that got worse during the pandemic. The rail carriers are also attempting to reduce the amount of crews on the trains. So right now there's 2 guys who run the train. And these trains can be anywhere from 1 mile to 3 miles long. They're getting longer. And they want to reduce that crew size down to 1 person per train, which is dangerous, right?
Right.
If there's a medical emergency on the train and you don't have a partner sitting there next to you, how do you know what's going to happen? Will this train just continue moving and crash into something? I mean, if there's any sort of problems where there's derailments or emergencies that happen, having 2 people, granted, you would want a larger crew, but right now it's 2 people. Having 2 people on the train means that, you can step into action and make sure that you're responding appropriately. The Fight for 2-Person Crews is this sort of auxiliary group that SMART TD, which is the unions, I believe it's SMART, that what they're trying to do is they're lobbying state legislatures to introduce legislation that would bar the ability for these rail carriers to reduce the crew sizes. Other pieces of the current contract fight have to do with just general worker safety, with the ability to have, wages that are commensurate with what's going on in the economy. All of these things are things that they're currently trying to fight for and have been trying to fight for the last 2 years, almost 3 years now. They started contract negotiations in 2019. And we're reaching a very interesting point in that. So there's a lot of different things that rail workers in the various divisions within the Class 1 freight railroads that they are worried about and trying to mitigate the effects of, But a very egregious one is this attendance policy, because it does affect how well you can do your job if you're tired all the time, or if you don't have the ability to take downtime in order to, mitigate the effects of being on 12 to 14 hours, then those things are compounding, both emotionally and physically. So
to me, it's like there's such a short-term focus by the companies here that not only are they sacrificing the health and safety of the workers involved, I mean, it seems like they would be sacrificing their own productivity eventually, right? Because you're burning these people out. You're going to have more mistakes, more accidents, presumably. Mm-hmm. The whole idea of just having 1 person on these trains is completely wild. And I'm glad you mentioned the state by state fight, because especially for those of you who are local who are listening, sounds like we need to be talking to our Alabama legislators to see, granted, not that there's a lot of hope for positive political change in the halls of Montgomery, but seriously, we need to be talking to them because, regardless of someone's politics, I mean, the supply chain is something that we're feeling across the board, some of us more than others, but we're all feeling it. We all sense it. But to me, that's what really sticks out is like there's a level of cruelty and short-term thinking involved to such a degree that it's not even really healthy for their own business on a long time scale. So I know capitalists are supposed to be so rational and so smart, motivated by the profit motive, that they're always going to make the rational market-based decision. At least that's what we're led to believe. But to me, your reporting on the railways just indicates that is not the case.
Well, and, it's funny because these policies have already had a ripple effect across the supply chain. Something like over 1,000 workers have quit or moved to commuter rail, which is a different area.
I think.
Nope, we lost you again, Mel.
Than the freight that we're talking about.
Mel, just a second. We lost you at they've moved to commuter rail.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, this internet is bad.
No worries.
But yeah, so they've moved away from freight, and what that means is there's not enough people to continue pushing freight, right? So what we're seeing are trains that are slowed down. We're seeing trains that are stopped. There's a lot of data that's come from the Surface Transportation Board about the effects that this is having. Truckers are moving as much freight as they can from the ports, but it's still causing a bottleneck because these containers aren't getting on trains. The trains aren't getting them to where they're supposed to be dropped off, right? So there's this whole ripple effect. So all these shipping that's coming from, outside of the United States that's getting dropped off at the ports, there's not enough space at the ports to drop those containers off. So you've got lines of, freight being just chilling off the coast of, LA, for example, because there's no space for it. They're seeing delays of anywhere from 6 to 12 days, and it's continuing to slow down. And it's causing such a problem that domestically, the freight can't be moved internally either. So, for example, with agriculture, we have grain and corn that cannot be refined and then sent to where it needs to go. It's sitting where it's supposed to be picked up. That's got a shelf life. You can't hang on to that forever.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so we're seeing this sort of ripple effect across all of the industry, both internally and, how we're bringing in freight from outside of the United States. And it's pissing off the suppliers themselves, right? Mm-hmm. Because these rail carriers, one thing to note as well is that the rail infrastructure is privately owned. So the rail carriers own tracks of track, right? And they lease it out to each other to be able to push this stuff through. It's not like public roads like interstates and stuff like that. So what's happening is that each of these rail carriers are, contracting with certain shippers to be able to say, okay, we'll put it on our trains. We'll take it to where it needs to go. And these shippers are like, where is it? Why hasn't it landed where you said it would be? It's delayed 12, 13, 14 hours every day for a period of 7 days. It's not getting to where it needs to go. We're upset. So they have gone to the federal government and said, hello, what's going on here? Can we figure this out? Because we are losing money now. It's not just the rail carriers losing money. We as the shippers are losing money, and it's happening across the board. There's no one that they can go to except maybe to try an independent trucking company that would be able to find space in their schedule to do that, So, it's not good,
Is there any way to quantify the economic effects that this is having on the economy? Have there been any analysis saying that, okay, if the rails had been able to be on time, then we would have put, I don't know, $500 billion more into the economy or something. Is there any analysis out there like that?
There's plenty of analysis about carloads and how far and how fast these carloads are making it across the United States. As far as actual numbers, I don't really have numbers in front of me to be able to talk very authoritatively about that. But you can imagine that a lot of money is being lost. And it's, consumers are feeling the effect of that as well, right? You were seeing that as a result, in many ways, you can kind of see that part of the reason we're having an inflation problem, and part of the reason that we're having such a high price point for things like food is because of these slowdowns across the entire system. And, I don't want to lump it all on just the railroads because there's many different moving parts about this, but it plays a huge part in how we move goods from, manufacturer to consumer. And you feel those ripple effects all the way across the board. You know what I mean?
One thing I wanted to ask you mentioned it a second ago about even the suppliers are going to the federal government. What has been the response, if there has been a response at all from the federal government in terms of addressing what is a pretty major economic problem that's affecting everyone from capital to labor?
Well, there was a bipartisan group of senators who sent a letter to, I believe, the Surface Transportation Board, if I'm remembering. The board. They sent it to Board Chairman Marty Oberman. They're like, these are senators that are representative of, a lot of middle America states or states that have a lot of agricultural output or, ranchers and energy producers across the country who are hearing from their constituents being the various lobbies that own these companies, right?
Right.
But they're saying, this is not good. This is really not cool. They're saying we are very concerned over the significant rail service disruptions. We've gotten reports from all sorts of people, and there's no alternative to get their goods to market. And in some instances, rail service problems have forced producers to completely stop production altogether for a period of time, right? And so there's all these lengthy delays. What are you going to do about it? As a result, like 2 years ago, the Biden administration put together a sort of like task force that is meant to address these problems because these bottlenecks and disruptions have been going on since before COVID, but certainly got worse when workers sickened and died due to COVID. And, that's a huge piece of this, right? We have to remember that the people making the supply chain move are human beings, right? And we lost 1 million people over the last 2 years. And a lot of those people worked in these industries and helped to make this economy run, right? And so, this task force is doing its best to try and address these problems. But again, it's bureaucratic red tape and administration. How much can they really do in terms of pushing this forward, right? In many ways.
So you've been laying out a lot of the effects on the workers, on their families, on consumers, on suppliers. Let's look at the flip side just for a second and talk to us, if you could lay out how the owners are doing of these rail companies.
They're doing great. They're having a ball. Union Pacific and Bnsf last year, in one of the quarters of 2021, posted over $1 billion in profit. Both of these companies separately. We're talking billions of dollars a year.
Just for folks, just a little bit of economics 101 for people who may not know, what does profit mean? What does revenue mean? Profit is the stuff that is left over after you have completed all of your expenses. It is your income minus your expenditures. So this is money that is left over after they pay everybody, after they pay their CEOs, after they pay all of their expenses, their rentals, their leases, and their employees, all of that. This is just money that is just left over after all the operations.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Let's see. Bnsf Railway Company logged $1.7 billion in net income in fourth quarter 2021, a 13% increase from 2020's bottom line. And this is from March 1st of this year, right? Union Pacific made 59% more. They made 59%, and this is from 2021. So they made, let's see, $1.8 billion per quarter.
Wow.
Multiply that times 4.
$1.8 billion a quarter.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert at the economy or railroads, but I got a feeling like $1.8 billion could probably hire some folks.
Yeah.
It could probably improve wages and benefits to make it a more attractive career. Just my, amateur understanding.
Yeah. I mean, that's always what it comes down to, right? And, especially with these contract negotiations, every time that you talk to a worker who's in the middle of contract negotiations with a business like this, a corporate business.
We lost you again.
That makes millions or billions of dollars.
Just a second. We lost you again. We lost you again, and you stopped at contract negotiations with these companies.
Yeah. Every time the workers are working to negotiate a contract with a corporation like this, they're not asking for much, in terms of in the grand scheme of things. They want a good work-life balance. They want solid benefits. They want people to stop slashing their pensions. They want health insurance that's going to cover their kids' dental. They want all this kind of stuff that is basic necessities for living a good life. They want good wages, right? If you were to calculate how much that costs per year, it's a drop in the bucket for these companies, especially for rail carriers, because they do make billions of dollars. And they where does it go? Warren Buffett's bank account? We're talking about 115,000 workers across the rails themselves who are being ground into dust because of these various cost-cutting measures. And they look at these CEOs and these billionaires who own these railroads, who are operating, all of these like horizontal monopolies across various industries, where if they lose money in one, it's not going to change how much money they make in another. And they see this, and they look at, they see these contract negotiations, and they see what these corporations are offering them. And it's like getting punched in the face repeatedly and then being asked to say thank you, that. It's insane to me. And it's, it's easy to see this with the railroads because of the disparity, how big that jump is, billions of dollars, and you're trying to take away my ability to safely operate a train because you want to make more. Jeff Kurtz in his speech at the rally said something like, they've squeezed all the blood they can out of us, and they wanted to keep squeezing more, and we have nothing left to give them. Another rail worker called the money that they make blood money, because they are really not doing well. They're overwhelmed. They're overworked. They're not paid enough. They're not given the chance to really rest and recover after shifts that can last anywhere from 12 to 14 hours, And at every turn, these managers, these corporations are doing whatever they can to punish the workforce for things that are out of their control, like medical emergencies or surprises in scheduling or what have you, Right, like, what are you supposed to do? How do you plan for an emergency? That's not what an emergency is, And
just last week, we got news that there were a couple of updates since the article about contract negotiations. The first thing was that the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, I believe, is the union that voted to authorize a strike and it's really convoluted the way that they do that. And I think that there was a couple more votes that had to happen, or that would have had to happen. But there was a vote made in which one of the trade unions said, their members were like, yes, we would like to open the avenue towards striking. And the president convened a presidential emergency board or something, which further delays their ability to strike legally. Talk to us about the contract negotiations up to this point, and then what the Presidential Emergency Board does and means.
Yeah. So the contract negotiations stalled out over about 2 years. And the thing about the railroads is it's governed by something called the Railway Labor Act, if I remember properly. And essentially what that legislation is a way to try and mitigate the very disastrous effects of a long-term stoppage. So, rail workers don't have same recourse to forcing negotiations forward as other plants governed by unions might. Say, for example, Kellogg's, once the contract's up, you can walk off the job. And you can stay off the job on strike for as long as necessary in order to get a contract, right? If you shut down the railroads, then your economy can collapse, which, is pretty good fucking leverage. You know what I mean? Yeah. But in terms of national defense and all of these other reasons, you can't just walk off the job when your contract expires. So for the last almost 3 years, railway workers have been working every day without a contract, essentially. The negotiations stalled out over the last 2 years. And then in, I think, like March or May, they brought it before the National Mediation Board, which is the sort of outside entity that is supposed to help them figure out a way forward with the negotiations. They step in, they try and mediate. If the process is not productive or fruitful, and both sides can't come to an agreement that they can then take back to the rank and file to ratify, then what happens is the National Mediation Board says, we're at an impasse. Okay, now we're going to activate these provisions in the RLA, and we're going to move forward with it. And what that looks like is a series of like cooling off periods where both sides walk away from the table, and they try and come forward with arbitration ideas or recommendations that maybe, both sides can agree on. We just are at the last 2 days of the first 30-day cooling off period, where during this time, in order to push forward negotiations, the current administration can appoint what's called a presidential emergency board. And usually these are like skilled arbitrators and negotiators who come in. And they will look at some of the recommendations that the NMB has suggested, whether that be arbitration, whether that be specific provisions in the contract, things like that. And then they will essentially submit a non-binding recommendation for a contract at the end. I think it's a 30-day period. So during that time, at any point, either side can reject this. So in the first 30 days, they offered arbitration. The unions rejected that because they don't want to enter into arbitration, because then that necessarily means that the rank and file don't have the ability to vote on and ratify a contract, if I'm remembering correctly. So we were 2 days away from a national rail shutdown when the Biden administration appointed the board yesterday. Goes into effect on the 18th. And then the board will, talk to both sides, get both sides, quote unquote, wish lists or where the negotiations are, the various places where they've stalled out. They will offer a non-binding contract recommendation, essentially. And then one or both sides can then either accept it and send it to the union to ratify, or not accept it. If I'm remembering this correctly, because it comes in stages, right? And then let me see. Let me get this information totally correct. So Yeah. So they collect evidence, they offer their recommendations, and then they once they offer their recommendations, both sides have another 30 days to mull it over. And if one or both sides reject it, which depending on who you talk to, I think a lot of folks are not particularly prepared to accept what the PEB might recommend, because oftentimes it's not perfect and it requires one or both sides to make concessions that maybe were like hard lines at the beginning of all of this. And if that's the case, then the door is open for the rail carriers to lock out their workers or for the unions to strike. If the unions strike, then what happens is, generally speaking, the federal government, the legislative body of the federal government, will step in and create emergency legislation that says, okay, here's your contract, because we can't have these railways shut down for even 6 hours. A 24 or 48-hour strike would paralyze the economy in a way that would be, I don't want to say catastrophic, because that's kind of alarmist, but it is a big deal. It's a big deal.
And so what is your, I guess the final question that I would have is, what is, I would like you to play future seeing, crystal ball looking into psychic. What is going to happen in your professional opinion?
In terms of, sorry, you cut out a little bit there. So
I was just asking, what is it that you think is going to happen? What do you think is the most likely thing to happen? Do you think that we're headed towards a strike? Do you think that we're headed towards the companies buckling before they get to a strike and giving into some of their demands? Do you think that that we're looking at the government or the companies somehow forcing the workers to heel? What do you think is the most likely?
It's kind of up in the air. We are in the middle of midterm elections. So it's very unusual that this would get this far. Oftentimes, when you're in the middle of midterms, legislators don't really want to wade into something like this. And I think the last time this happened was like the late 90s. And ultimately what happened is, I think that they averted a lockout, a strike, and ratified a contract. Well, it's weird. I'm not sure what's going to happen. It really depends on, the political climate over the next 60 days and how the rank and file feel. But it sounds to me like, just based on the messaging coming from Smart TD and BLAT and the various members of the bargaining committee, is that, they want to break this stalemate, but they're not going to back down from what they're asking for. And if it necessitates a strike, or it necessitates pushing this all the way to the logical end of the RLA, which is, legislation, then they're going to do that, because they're trying really hard to go to bat for their workers, because conditions have gotten that bad, And one thing to note is, if there is a legislation that is passed, apparently, based on the research that I did for this article, the way to go forward is that the legislation that's adopted is likely going to be the recommendations that the PEB makes in the first place. So, once it gets to that point, that's it. That's the contract for the next 3 years or what have you. And so hopefully what happens is that there is a way to break this stalemate, and that, union workers can ratify a contract that they are satisfied with. But it remains to be seen what's going to happen. I mean, it's a pretty thorny issue. And
surely Democrats in Congress would not pass a law forcing these workers to take a bad contract. I mean, surely not.
Yeah, about that. As
a
political, yes, it's
an opportunity for the Democrats who control the White House, who control Congress, to come out on the side of workers
at basically no cost. Like, who's the person that would be harmed by this? Oh, the rail billionaires? Like, who cares?
Well, it's one of those things where, like, when you're in the middle of a re-election campaign, you really don't want to be focused on this, right? And it can engender some, you're not trying to alienate potentially not, anti-union voters or what have you. You know what I mean? It just becomes this weird political situation. When the reality is like, once again, it's about the rank and file workers. It's about these workers who are being ground to dust every day, who are tired and who are, experiencing the worst working conditions that I've ever heard from certain, from workers in the last year and a half, like fucked up shit. And, they deserve to have some relief, and they deserve the solidarity that they've been getting over the last couple of months as we've been pushing this story further and further outwards. Hopefully it is a contract that folks can be satisfied with. And hopefully the board that is appointed is full of individuals who are able to really dial in on what the workers are asking for and present recommendations that are going to be useful. Right. But again, you're coming up against billion-dollar companies that are perfectly fine with dragging this out as long as possible because they have the money and the resources to do so, to the detriment of the entire fucking economy. But,
Right. Yeah. And I think this is one of those situations where, I think from my perspective as a unionist, I never want to see the government getting involved. I think that usually indicates that there's been a breakdown.
Right.
But in this case, because of the unique legal restrictions on railways and just the general leverage point it plays in the economy, there is an opportunity for federal force to be used on the side of workers.
And to at least not be used on the side of bosses.
Right. And I think there's also a compelling political story there to talk about workers who are being ground into dust. And that's part of the reason why you're paying higher prices at the grocery stores, because they're screwing these people over while you're getting screwed too. Right. And it's time, and we can do something about it. Right?
It would be an inflation attacking measure. We're fighting inflation. We're fighting for you by fighting inflation, by making these rail companies, pay their workers so that they can continue.
Right. So I could see Bernie giving this speech, but
we'll see
whether or not anyone else
we'll see what
approaches it in that way. We'll see what happens. But I really appreciate your reporting on this because it is very complex and complicated. And I liked your comparison of the supply chain to the cardiovascular system of a human being. I thought that was really good and helped me to understand it. So I just want to encourage folks to read your piece with the Real News Network.
Thank you.
Definitely stay tuned on this because it is something that could have far-reaching effects on certainly these workers who deserve our love and solidarity, but really everyone who's participating in the economy.
Right. The article is Corporate Billionaires Are Wrecking the Supply Chain. Just look at the railroads. The author is Mel Buer. You can find her on Twitter and follow her work and her reporting as this issue continues. Her Twitter handle is Mel_Buer, MEL_BUER. Make sure you check her out. Mel, thank you for talking to us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me on again. It's always a good conversation.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project. And you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.